This is a video on components. Components are like the building blocks of our websites or applications. So something that a component would be something like a button. And components are also how we add interactivity into Figma in our prototypes. But components can be all kinds of things, and you can use them in all kinds of ways. So an easier way to get your head around that would be to show you some examples. This is the Material 3 design kit. This is Google's design system for their operating software and for their applications. So you can see over here on the left-hand side in these different pages, they start out with some different components like avatars or pictures. They have all their icons in here, examples of how these things are put to use to make some basic wireframes and page layouts. Styles that can be applied to those components. And then further down here, you get into the actual things you would be more familiar seeing, things like app bars or menus, badges, their own buttons, all these different kinds of buttons that they have, and then variations of them. And those things get built together into larger items or organisms like cards. And we'll talk more about the atomic design system and kind of how to think about these structures. But the whole point of this is that this makes building stuff and prototyping things a lot easier and faster. And so it's something you should definitely be doing when you're working in Figma. So let's start with something like a button. You can see here I've already built a couple just as an example. So let's go ahead and make a new frame. I'm just going to copy this one and delete what I have on it. And we'll start fresh. Okay, let's say that I want to make a new button for all my pages in my app or website. The way that I would start that, I would first start with some text. And then we're going to frame that text to build the background instead of using the rectangle tool like we've talked about. We're instead going to frame it by framing the selection. I could also draw it with this frame tool, but a nice shortcut here is to right-click and then use frame selection. This will be easier to see if I go ahead and add a background to it with a fill, and then we'll change that color. I'm just going to make it blue so we have a different color to work with. And then we'll change that text to white. And then instead of just having this be a selection, we're going to make this an auto layout frame, which will allow the selection or the background to grow or contract to what's inside of it. That icon is over here. It's this little few different rectangles. And you'll see immediately what happened was our background shrunk, and that content is being centered both vertically and horizontally inside that frame. We need to give ourselves a little bit of space around this because this looks super tight there. So what we're going to do is use these icons over here to add some padding, both vertically and horizontally inside it. So let's go ahead and add ourselves, I don't know, 10 pixels of horizontal padding. You can also see that shows up in these blue bars here. And then we can also add 10 pixels of vertical padding. So that looks much more comfortable. To make this look more like a button, depending on the styling of your site, you could also round the corners there over here in appearance. And this is starting to look more like something you would actually see on a website. But let's say we have a bunch of different pages and we want to reuse this button over and over. I'm first going to rename this to button. We could copy paste it, and you can get multiples of that, but what if we decide we want to change, I don't know, the typeface that we're using in the future? Then we would have to go through our entire application and change all of those things across the board. So instead, We're going to turn this button into a component, which tells Figma, hey, this is a basic building block, and I want to reuse this over and over. To do that, you could right-click and go down to Create Component, or use the shortcut here. Probably for a little bit, it's going to be faster to come over here and select this icon over here in your Properties panel, the little diamond shape. And then you'll see we get a purple outline around our item here. Now what that does is it turns this into our main component. So if I go over to my Assets panel now, and I go to open that up, you can see that I have my initial button that I made before this video, and then this is our new one. If I right-click on that, I can go look at the details of this, and then insert an instance. You can also do that just by dragging it onto the canvas. And you'll see that's an easy way to add more instances of this button. But these are just copies. So if I wanted to make any changes, I could go to the main component, and you'll see it selects it here. Let's say I wanted to make this button green instead, and I want all the buttons across my site to be green. You'll see when I change that main component, it changes all of them. So there's all kinds of cool stuff we can do with components that we can't do with just regular designs. So let's first rename this to something sensible. You'll see over here in my layers panel, components are listed in purple. And then instances of components, let me just make an instance here, are a hollow diamond shape. And then the main component has the 4 little circles around it. So let's name this something sensible. This will be my second button example. And then we're going to clean this up a little bit and do some other cool stuff. So components can also have what are called properties, which are how we get these different states of things. Like if I jump to the material buttons, you'll see they have, filled buttons with and without icons, and then filled or outlined buttons, all different kinds of properties, essentially. We can add our own properties to this button over in our Properties panel on the main component. So I can click Add Property, and then you'll see we have a couple different types of properties we can add. We're going to start with a variant, which basically means different types of this button. Instead of naming this property 1, I'm going to name this state. You'll see why in just a second once we get into prototyping. So now we have state default, and then let's also make the text in here a property. So we can do that by selecting text here. You'll see this says click here, this is my text. This icon allows me to apply a variable or property to that. So I'm going to go ahead and click a new variable or property. It'll be a property of text, and the value can be click here, that's fine. So now if I insert an instance of this button, you'll see I have the state. There's only one right now. And then the text, I can update this here. And that will automatically update the text in the instance of the component. And because this is an auto layout frame, it will automatically expand that background to fit the text inside it, which is pretty cool. So let's go ahead and add a second variant to this button, and we'll start talking about prototyping. So you'll see down here, right now it says this is a component with 1 variant and a little plus. Let's go ahead and add a variant to that. You'll see it makes an exact copy. And let's give ourselves like a secondary button. So oftentimes on a website, you'll see The main call to action will have a button that's filled in, and then if there's a secondary action, it will be outlined. So let's go ahead and do that by swapping the fill and stroke on this. So you can see my fill is this green. I don't have a stroke right now. Handy shortcut for that to swap those is to hit Shift X. You'll see I now have a green stroke. My text has disappeared because it's white, but that's okay. We'll just go ahead and swap that to green. And now this can be our secondary button. So let's go ahead and select that. Right now it's given it a name of state 2 instead of default. Let's rename this to secondary. And now if I were to insert an instance of that just to show you what we did, you'll see over here I can swap that state to secondary and we get that outline button. Let's do a few more to talk about how prototyping works. So let's go ahead and select our first one, the primary state or the default state. And in fact, let's go ahead and rename that to primary. I'm going to make a new variant of that, and I'm going to give this one a slightly darker color. So instead of this kind of forest green, let's go down to just a little bit darker, like almost black. I'm going to expand this and just kind of reorganize a little bit. And then what we can do is our first instance of prototyping. So we can add what's called a hover state, which essentially when you hover over something, like if I hover over our tools down here, you can see that the background of the tool, that button, becomes a slightly lighter shade to tell me, hey, this is something you can click on. We can simulate that in Figma by adding prototype states between different components. So as an example, we've been working in the design tab so far. I'm going to select on prototype over here, and you'll see my whole properties panel changes. So I now have this little blue plus that shows up, and I hover over the button, and I can click and drag an arrow out of that. So what I can do is link this to this other variant, and then tell it to do an interaction when I do something, and we're going to define what that is. So the trigger is what causes this interaction. I'm going to change this to while hovering. And then the action, change to, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do in here. Change to is right for what we want to do. And then state, we are going to switch to our state 3 is this one. We should have named this first, but yes, state 3 is correct. So when we hover on this, this is going to change to this new state. Now I'm going to rename this right now just before we get too much further. So I'm going to name this to primary-hover. And then if I go back into my prototype tab and I select that interaction, you'll see that it's updated that name. So let's insert an instance of this and see what happened there. So this looks normal. What I'm going to do is open up our preview menu. So I'm going to select this frame. You have to have a frame to preview something. I could hit the play button, the present button, and open it up in a new tab. When you're working, sometimes it's handy to use the preview menu instead. And this will open up the frame that I have in a new window. So now, when I hover over top of that button, you'll see it changes to that darker background. So it actually looks like a real button, which is pretty cool. We can do the same thing with our secondary button. And we'll just do a different interaction type just for the sake of it here. So first I'm going to select that. I'm going to add a new variant, which gives me a copy of that. And this one, let's go ahead and give it a fill. Let's give it like a lighter green fill when we hover over top of it. And then maybe instead of bold text when we hover over it or click on it or whatever our interaction is, maybe this changes to thin text, and you'll see that is going to change the width of our box too. So this is not great UX design, but just to show you what's possible in here, I'm going to do that. So instead of hovering, I'm going to switch back to my prototype tab. I'm going to select our secondary button. I'm going to link our secondary button to our new variant. And in fact, I'm going to go back to design and rename that variant from state vor to secondary hover. And then back in the prototype tab. Instead of while hovering, let's do on click. Change to secondary hover. And then we could add animations. We're not going to get into that right now. And you'll see by adding an instance of that. And let's switch this to our secondary button and then open our preview back up. When I hover over the first one, it turns dark. When I hover over the secondary one, nothing happens. But when I click on it, it changes to our secondary hover state. However, there's no way to get back. So we can actually link this one, our hover state. In fact, we should rename it click state. I can link this now back to the primary, or not the primary, the initial state of the secondary button. On click, change to secondary. And now you'll see because of these two crosses, they're linked to each other. So if I preview this, every time I click on it, it will change to the other state. So those are the basics of components. They're basically building blocks for design applications and websites. And the other thing they allow us to do is to use properties, and then we can also prototype between those things.